300 million years ago, Earth was a world of endless swamps and towering giants, dragonflies the size of seagulls and forests that would one day become coal. Why did life grow so large in this strange age? In this video, we'll step into the Carboniferous. If you enjoy it, please like, subscribe and share, and tell us in the comments which creature or landscape amazed you most. Thank you for watching. Now, let's begin. During the Carboniferous period, continental plates continue their slow motion across the planet's surface. Laurussia spans tropical latitudes where warm air and frequent rainfall prevail. Gondwana extends across the southern hemisphere into polar regions where ice accumulates. Ocean basins between these landmasses narrow as subduction and collision proceed along segmented margins. The closing of these seaways leaves records in belts of deformation, where continental crust shortens, thickens and uplifts into mountain ranges that later erode and feed adjacent basins with sediment. Along the margin of the land that will become eastern North America, compressional stress generates folds and thrust faults during the Alleghenian orogeny. Sedimentary layers buckle into broad anticlines and synclines. Low-grade metamorphism alters mudstone to slate and phyllite, while sandstones recrystallize to quartzite. Granite bodies intrude at depth and cool, slowly forming coarse crystals that interlock. In Western and Central Europe, a related collision produces the Variscan Belt. There, structural trends run from the Iberian Peninsula through the Massif Central and into the Bohemian Massif. Metamorphic zones with index minerals reveal gradients of temperature and pressure that mark the internal architecture of the origin. These features mapped in the field and traced in subsurface data indicate progressive convergence and suturing of distinct terrains. As mountains rise, the lithosphere flexes downward on their flanks and forms foreland basins. In these depressions, thick successions of sediment accumulate. Coarse gravels and sands deposit first as alluvial fans at the mountain front. Farther basinward, braided rivers lay down tabular beds of sand that fine upward into silt as channels migrate. Floodplain muds settle from suspension during seasonal inundation. Calcrete nodules locally form in intervals of exposure-recording pauses in deposition. Organic detritus collects in waterlogged backswamps, where decay remains slow because oxygen is limited within saturated soils. Peat layers begin to form in these settings and later compress into coal when buried beneath additional sediment. Across low-lying interiors, shallow epicontinental seas occupy broad tracts of continental crust. These seas are rarely deep, yet they cover great distances when global sea level rises. During intervals of glacial growth on Gondwana, water is stored on land as ice and sea level falls. During intervals of glacial retreat, meltwater returns to the oceans and sea level rises. Each shift causes shorelines to migrate across plains with very small gradients. Where marine waters advance, carbonate sediment accumulates on warm shelves, producing limestones packed with broken plates of crinoids, brachiopod shells, and skeletal grains. Where the sea withdraws, coastal marshes and deltas prograde depositing sand and mud above marine beds. The resulting alternation of faces produces repetitive successions known as cyclothems, in which coal shale, sandstone and limestone stack in patterns that match transgressions and regressions. At tropical latitudes, dense forests develop on poorly drained ground. Lycopsids establish tall, straight trunks with scaly bark and crown leaves arranged around terminal cones. Their rooting systems spread laterally through stigmarian axes that radiate within soft substrate anchoring trees in unstable ground. Seed ferns grow large fronds beneath the canopy, and horsetails form dense stands along channel margins. The understory holds club mosses and early ferns that tolerate shade and frequent flooding. When storms topple, trees' trunks settle into water and sink. In the anoxic pore waters of peat, cellulose and lignin break down only partly. New floods blanket this organic mat with silt and fine sand-sealing plant tissues from oxidation. Compaction aligns plant fragments, and the layer transforms step by step into lignite, and then into higher rank coal with additional burial and heating. Sediment routing from uplands into these wetlands follows predictable paths controlled by gradient and accommodation. Coarse bed load remains near the mountain front while suspended load continues toward distal flats. Avulsions occur when channels build levees and then breach them, relocating flow across the plain. Abandoned channels infill with mud and plant debris. Where the water table stays at or above the surface for long stretches, peat bodies become laterally extensive and can persist through multiple minor floods. Where relative sea level rises faster than peat growth, brackish waters invade and introduce marine microfossils into the mud, forming distinctive brackish or marine markers above coal. In the high southern latitudes, ice sheets over Gondwana advance across plateaus and valleys. Basal sliding and freeze-thaw cycles pluck blocks from bedrock while abrasion grinds rock flour that clouds meltwater streams. Where glaciers reach marine embayments, they carve, and icebergs carry coarse debris far from shore. As icebergs melt, isolated pebbles and cobbles fall through quiet seawater and embed within fine mud. These dropstones deform laminae beneath them and create localized drapes above them, a texture that allows recognition of glacial influence within otherwise calm marine deposits. Tillites and striated pavements on the continent add further indicators of grounded ice. Orogenic topography modifies atmospheric flow. Moist air rises along windward slopes, cools adiabatically, and sheds rainfall that sustains perennial rivers. On leeward slopes descending, air warms and inhibits condensation, producing drier intervals recorded by red mudstones with iron oxides. Farther from the origin, monsoon-like reversals may seasonally alter river discharge and sediment caliber, documented by rhythmic bundles of fine and coarser laminae. In swamp belts, the height of the water table relative to the land surface governs plant community structure. Slight rises in base level convert forested ground to open mire. Slight falls permit rooting and soil development, which imprint slicken sides, root traces and paleosol horizons into the stratigraphy. Multiple independent methods constrain this geographic arrangement. Paleomagnetic declinations and inclinations measured in volcanic units, and well-behaved sedimentary intervals, place Laurussia at near equatorial latitudes. Spores and macrofloras with features consistent with humid warmth corroborate that position. In Gondwana, glendonites and other cold water indicators associate with diamictites supporting polar settings. Structural mapping follows major thrusts and fold axes through the Alleghanian and Variscan belts, defining the extent of collision zones. Conodont color alteration indices calibrate burial temperatures that match metamorphic grade patterns across these belts. Stable carbon and oxygen isotopes in marine carbonates track changes in water mass composition and help align transgressive-regressive cycles among basins separated by great distances. Within foreland basins, subsidence rates vary through time as loads shift and as thrust sheets advance. Where subsidence is high, accommodation outpaces sediment supply and preserves thick, finer-grained packages with numerous coal seams. Where sediment supply temporarily exceeds accommodation, sand-rich bodies stack and amalgamate, creating multi-story channel complexes. The geometry of these bodies guides later groundwater flow and affects how organic layers compact beneath them. Rooted horizons with stigmarian systems penetrate several decimeters into paleosols, and their patterns help identify in situ forest floors versus transported mats. Arthropod trackways and vertebrate footprints cross silty surfaces left by receding floods and are later buried by the next pulse of mud. In shallow marine shelves, carbonate factories operate where light penetrates, and water chemistry favours precipitation. Crinoid stems break and carpet the seafloor with discs that accumulate as grainstones during fair weather, and as packstones when storms winnow and redeposit skeletal debris. Quiet intervals allow mycorrhiza to settle, producing thin lime mud layers between storm beds. Offshore fine clay falls from suspension and forms dark shales that host conodont elements and foraminifera tests used for biostratigraphic correlation. Upsection, a sharp surface, often marks the return of terrestrial influence, as deltas prograde followed again by peat growth on emergent flats, when accommodation and freshwater input align. At the equator, tidal range and wave energy vary among embayments and straits created by irregular paleogeography. In protected settings, brackish marshes develop with mixed plant communities tolerant of salinity. Thin laminites of alternating organic matter and silt record daily or seasonal rhythms. In more open reaches, tidal channels cut mudflats and create sinuous sand bodies that migrate laterally. Where such channels intersect peat surfaces, they erode into the organic layer and leave sharp scours later filled by sand, a contact that field geologists trace to reconstruct shoreline trajectories. Toward the close of this interval of deposition within a given basin, relative sea level may rise modestly as far-field glacial mass increases. Saline water begins to pond in the lowest swales of the swamp. The uppermost peat surface breaks into rafts that drift a short distance and sink. A film of very fine grey clay settles from quiet water onto the irregular peat top, and the first scattered shell fragments appear within that clay. In the next flood season, silt plumes spread over the area, and a narrow, newly established channel lays down a lens of fine sand that feathers out across the mire, where fresh rootlets soon probe the soft substrate. Shallow epicontinental seas stretch far across the interiors of continents, during the Carboniferous advancing and retreating in tune with changes in sea level and crustal motion. These seas are not deep ocean basins, but broad expanses of water that cover low-lying land where the surface sits only slightly above present sea level. Because the gradient is gentle, even small shifts in water volume cause shorelines to migrate across hundreds of kilometers. As ice sheets in Gondwana grow, sea level falls and exposes wide plains. As the ice retreats, meltwater flows back to the oceans, and seas return over the land. This constant oscillation creates a repeating pattern of environments, recorded layer by layer in the sedimentary record. When seas advance, carbonate platforms flourish. Warm, clear, shallow water supports abundant skeletal organisms, crinoids with stalks anchored to the seafloor, and feathery arms extending upward dominate many areas. As storms pass, their segments break apart and accumulate in thick beds of limestone composed almost entirely of crinoid debris. Rugose corals and tabulate corals build small reefs, though not as extensive as those seen in earlier times. Brachiopods settle in clusters attaching to firm substrates, or resting freely on soft sediment. Foraminifera, tiny single-celled organisms with shells, drift through the water and settle after death, leaving microscopic evidence in lime mud. Conodont animals known mainly from their tooth-like elements also inhabit these seas, and their fossilized parts later provide a valuable tool for precise dating of the layers. When seas retreat, the environment shifts to mudflats, deltas, and river plains. Sand and silt carried by rivers spread outward, forming broad sheets of sediment. In these places, plants take root and soils develop. The transition from marine limestone to terrestrial mudstone occurs repeatedly within short vertical distances in the stratigraphic record. Within some intervals, coal seams lie directly above marine limestone, showing how a peat swamp established itself soon after the sea withdrew. Such sharp boundaries record the rapidity with which environments could shift in response to sea level change. Sedimentary structures within these layers capture details of the processes. Ripple marks preserved in sandstone show the action of waves and currents in shallow water. Mud cracks preserved in shale show that mud once dried and contracted under subaerial exposure. Cross-bedding in sandstones records migrating ripples and dunes within tidal channels or river systems. Graded bedding reveals sediment that settled from waning flows. Geologists reading these signs reconstruct the ancient environment with care, using each layer as a clue to water depth, current direction, and energy level. Cyclothams stand out as one of the most characteristic features of Carboniferous stratigraphy. A typical cyclotham begins with marine limestone deposited when seas transgress across the land. Above it lies shale, representing quieter water or deeper conditions. Sandstone layers mark prograding deltas as rivers build outward. Coal seams rest on paleosols where vegetation once grew in waterlogged ground. Another limestone caps the sequence as the sea advances again. These cycles repeat many times stacked one above another, forming thick successions that stretch across vast regions. Their widespread correlation shows that they are driven by global factors, not just local processes. The main driver is linked to glacial-interglacial cycles on Gondwana, where ice volume fluctuates in rhythms that may be tied to long-term variations in Earth's orbit. Marine fossils within the limestones give further detail. Crinoid stems lie scattered in dense mats, each disc representing a broken segment of stalk. Brachiopod shells appear whole or fragmented, some still articulated, suggesting gentle burial, while others are disarticulated and abraded, showing transport by waves. Rugose corals grow in solitary cups that rise from the seafloor, and colonies of tabulate corals form low mounds. Bryozoans create branching or fan-shaped colonies that contribute skeletal fragments to the sediment. Each group has specific ecological preferences, and their abundance in certain layers helps reconstruct conditions such as water depth and clarity. Trace fossils also appear in these sediments. Burrows filled with sand contrast with surrounding mud, showing where organisms once lived. Vertical tubes indicate suspension feeders that anchored themselves in the soft substrate. Horizontal meanders record the trails of deposit feeders searching for organic particles. Tracks and resting traces appear on bedding surfaces preserved when rapid burial sealed them before erosion. These traces provide direct evidence of behavior and activity that skeletal fossils alone cannot reveal. Chemical signals complement the physical and biological evidence. Ratios of oxygen isotopes in carbonate minerals reflect temperature and ice volume. Carbon isotopes record changes in the global carbon cycle, influenced by burial of organic material in coal swamps. Strontium isotopes trace the balance between continental weathering and volcanic input. These geochemical records align with sedimentary cycles, strengthening the interpretation that sea level changes link to global glacial rhythms. The spatial extent of epicontinental seas means that similar sequences occur across large areas. In North America, the mid-continent region preserves thick cyclotham successions that extend across states. In Europe, basins from the British Isles to central Germany record comparable patterns. Even in regions separated by great distances, similar orders of limestone shale, sandstone and coal recur. This consistency shows that global processes control deposition. At the same time, local variations in thickness, fossil content, and sediment type reflect regional differences in subsidence sediment supply and biological communities. In some places, carbonate platforms grow thick, producing massive limestones that form cliffs today. In others, siliciclastic input dominates, and sandstones alternate with thin coals. The distribution depends on proximity to uplands, the rate of basin subsidence, and the relative position to ancient shorelines. Detailed field studies map these variations, and stratigraphic correlation aligns them into broader frameworks. Conodont biostratigraphy provides fine-scale resolution, allowing correlation of thin layers across basins. Such precision demonstrates how stable and repetitive these depositional patterns were through much of the Carboniferous. As epicontinental seas advance and retreat, they influence ecosystems on land and sea alike. Marine organisms expand their ranges during transgressions and retreat to refuges during regressions. Terrestrial plants colonize exposed plains only to be drowned again when seas return. Amphibians and reptiles adapt to shifting wetlands at the margins. In every case, the boundary between land and sea is dynamic, moving back and forth in cycles that persist for millions of years. These changes occur slowly on human timescales but are geologically rapid, leaving a clear rhythm in the stratigraphic record. Across the southern reaches of Gondwana during the Carboniferous, great ice sheets expand and contract in cycles that dominate the climate system of the time. These glaciers cover large portions of what is now South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and the Indian subcontinent. Their thickness reaches several kilometers, and their movement sculpts valleys and highlands alike. As they advance, they scrape across the bedrock, carving striations that align with the direction of ice flow. Rocks plucked from the ground are transported within the ice and deposited hundreds of kilometers away. When the glaciers retreat, they leave behind tillites, unsorted mixtures of clay, sand, gravel, and boulders that solidify into rock and preserve direct evidence of glacial activity. These deposits are widespread and form one of the most important markers of Gondwanan glaciation. The waxing and waning of ice sheets link closely to changes in sea level. When glaciers grow, they store immense amounts of water on land. Global sea level falls and epicontinental seas in equatorial regions withdraw, exposing wide coastal plains. When glaciers shrink, meltwater returns to the ocean, raising sea level and allowing seas to advance inland once more. The timing of these cycles matches repeated patterns seen in sedimentary sequences of tropical regions, where alternating marine and terrestrial deposits appear stacked one upon another. Cyclothams in North America and Europe owe much of their rhythm to these southern glacial cycles. The climate impact of Gondwanan ice sheets extends beyond sea level alone. As ice spreads, the high reflectivity of its surface increases the amount of sunlight reflected back into space, lowering global temperatures. Cold winds blow outward from the ice sheets, carrying dust that settles into distant basins. These winds influence atmospheric circulation on a planetary scale, pushing storm tracks and altering rainfall distribution. Evidence of such changes appears in the sediments of regions far from the ice, where layers of silt and fine sand mark episodes of increased dust deposition. Geochemical analyses of these layers reveal mineral compositions consistent with sources in glaciated highlands, confirming long-distance transport by wind. In marine records, dropstones serve as another clear sign of glaciation. These isolated clasts, sometimes cobble-sized, occur within fine-grained marine shales. Their presence indicates that icebergs carried rock debris far from shore. As the icebergs melted, the rocks fell through the water column and embedded themselves in soft mud on the seafloor. The surrounding sediment later hardened into rock, locking the dropstones in place. These features are scattered through marine strata of Carboniferous age aligning with times when glaciers advanced and carved icebergs into nearby seas. Glacial advances and retreats may be paced by long-term variations in Earth's orbit known as Milankovitch cycles. These cycles alter the amount and distribution of solar energy received at high latitudes. Shifts in eccentricity, obliquity, and precession combine to create conditions favourable for either glacial growth or melting. The sedimentary record of the Carboniferous preserves rhythms consistent with these astronomical influences. While the details remain under study, many geologists recognise orbital pacing as a major control on glacial-interglacial cycles of this time. The direct evidence of glaciation in Gondwana provides context for understanding equatorial environments. Coal swamps in tropical regions thrive or vanish, depending on whether sea level rises or falls. A glacial advance in the south leads to regression of the seas in the tropics, exposing broad areas where forests spread and peat accumulates. A glacial retreat allows seas to return drowning swamps and covering peat with marine sediments. These alternations preserve the layered sequences that now appear as cyclothems. Thus, the distant ice sheets of Gondwana exert a strong influence on environments thousands of kilometers away. The physical features of Gondwanan glaciation also include striated pavements, where grooves carved by ice remain etched into bedrock surfaces. These pavements often show intersecting sets of striations, revealing changes in ice flow direction through time. Erratic boulders transported far from their original source areas sit within otherwise fine-grained deposits. Their mismatched lithology betrays their foreign origin, confirming long-distance movement by glacial ice. In some basins, thick accumulations of tillite interbedded with marine shales record repeated episodes of glacial advance and retreat. Each tillite layer represents a pulse of ice cover, while intervening marine sediments represent times of retreat and higher sea level. The distribution of glacial deposits across Gondwana suggests that ice centres formed on upland regions and radiated outward. Reconstructions show separate glacial lobes extending across South America, southern Africa, and Antarctica. As ice moved from highlands toward lower terrain, it carried debris into marine basins, contributing to characteristic mixed deposits. These reconstructions rely on field mapping of tillites, dropstones, and striated pavements, combined with paleomagnetic and stratigraphic data that establish the position of the continents. Together, they outline a coherent picture of widespread glaciation across southern latitudes during the Carboniferous. The influence of glaciation extends into chemical records as well. Isotopic ratios of oxygen in marine carbonates reflect shifts in global ice volume, with heavier values during times of expanded ice and lighter values during retreats. These records align with sedimentary evidence of sea level change, strengthening the interpretation of glacial control. Carbon isotopes affected by burial of organic matter in equatorial coal swamps also fluctuate in step with glacial cycles, demonstrating the interconnectedness of high-latitude ice and low-latitude ecosystems. In addition to climate and sea level effects, the erosion caused by glaciers contributes to sediment supply in marine and continental basins. Rock flour produced beneath the ice clouds, meltwater streams depositing fine silts downstream. Larger clasts transported by ice form moraines at glacier margins. These materials enter rivers and eventually reach distant basins, influencing sediment composition far from the ice sheets themselves. The contribution of glacially derived sediment can be identified by distinctive mineral assemblages and strontium isotopic signatures. The long persistence of Gondwanan glaciation through much of the Carboniferous makes this period distinct in Earth history. Unlike short-lived glacial events of earlier times, these ice sheets endure for tens of millions of years, waxing and waning but never vanishing entirely. Their presence defines the Carboniferous as part of a long icehouse climate state, in contrast to greenhouse intervals when polar regions remain free of ice. This enduring ice cover shapes not only southern landscapes, but also the global distribution of sea swamps and sediments that characterize the period. Climate during the Carboniferous shifts repeatedly between glacial and interglacial states, creating a rhythmic pattern that influences environments across the globe. At high latitudes, the waxing and waning of ice sheets drives changes in sea level. In equatorial regions, the same cycles bring alternations of wetland expansion, marine flooding, and soil development. These repeating transitions leave a clear imprint in the stratigraphic record, and their regularity suggests control by astronomical forcing combined with feedbacks within the climate system. Each cycle unfolds over hundreds of thousands of years long, compared to human experience yet brief on the scale of geologic time. The alternation of glacial and interglacial intervals regulates global temperature. During glacial maxima, the growth of ice sheets increases Earth's albedo, reflecting more sunlight back into space and reinforcing cooling. Cold winds spread outward from the ice, carrying dust and affecting rainfall patterns at lower latitudes. During interglacials, the retreat of ice lowers albedo and allows warming. Meltwater released to the oceans raises sea level, and circulation patterns in both atmosphere and ocean respond to the new distribution of thermal contrasts. Evidence for these shifts appears in isotopic record sedimentary structures and fossil assemblages preserved across different continents. One of the clearest expressions of these cycles is the sequence of cyclothems found in basins of North America, Europe, and Asia. Each cyclothem represents a full glacial-interglacial cycle captured in rock. The base of the cycle often contains marine limestone deposited when seas advanced into continental interiors during high sea level. Above it lies shale deposited in quieter, deeper conditions. Sandstones record prograding deltas as rivers filled newly created space. Coal seams crown the sequence representing peat accumulation in swamps during low sea level and humid conditions. Another marine limestone then marks the return of high sea level as the cycle repeats. This stacking pattern continues for tens of meters, recording dozens of successive cycles through the Carboniferous. Paleosols or fossil soils add further detail to this record. In intervals when sea level remained low long enough for stable landscapes to develop, soils formed on exposed surfaces. These paleosols preserve root traces, soil horizons, and geochemical signatures that indicate rainfall and drainage conditions. Some paleosols are glaze, showing formation under waterlogged conditions, while others are calcareous with carbonate nodules that reflect drier climates and evaporation. Their alternation with coal seams and marine beds reveals the tight coupling of climate, sea level, and vegetation through time. Climate cycles also affect atmospheric circulation. During glacial advances, strong latitudinal temperature gradients intensify wind belts, carrying dust from dry regions into distant basins. Thin laminae of silt within shales sometimes contain mineral compositions pointing to sources in glaciated highlands far to the south. During interglacials, rainfall increases across equatorial regions, expanding swamp forests and rivers. These variations shape the ecological distribution of plants and animals, leaving behind changes in fossil abundance and diversity that align with the larger glacial rhythm. In equatorial wetlands, humid intervals support the spread of leucopsid and seed fern forests that generate thick peat deposits. Intervals of relative dryness lead to contraction of swamps and expansion of soils with oxidized horizons. Such changes appear in spores preserved in sediments, where species composition reflects shifting plant communities The microscopic record of spores shows alternations between assemblages dominated by wetland plants and those including more drought-tolerant taxa. These cycles confirm that vegetation responded directly to broader climatic forcing. Oxygen isotope ratios in marine carbonates provide another line of evidence. Heavier values correspond to times of expanded ice sheets, when more of the lighter isotope was locked away in ice. Lighter values align with interglacials when ice volume declined. These isotopic fluctuations parallel the stacking of cyclothems linking tropical sedimentary sequences to high-latitude glaciation. Carbon isotopes track the burial of organic matter, which increased during intervals of widespread peat formation and coal accumulation. These geochemical markers show that glacial-interglacial cycles influence not only physical environments, but also the global carbon cycle. The amplitude of sea level change associated with these cycles was substantial. Estimates suggest swings of tens of meters enough to shift shorelines hundreds of kilometers across flat continental interiors. For organisms inhabiting coastal plains and shallow seas, these changes meant repeated relocation of habitats. Marine invertebrates colonized advancing shorelines during high stands, then retreated or perished as regression exposed the seafloor. Terrestrial plants spread across newly emergent land only to be drowned again in the next transgression. This constant reorganization of habitats may have encouraged evolutionary diversification by creating alternating opportunities and stresses. Evidence of climate cycles also appears in coal itself. Petrographic studies reveal subtle layering within coal seams that reflect seasonal or longer-term variations in plant input and water level. Some seams contain thin partings of shale or silt that represent brief flooding events or interruptions in peat accumulation. Others show changes in masseral composition pointing to shifts in vegetation over time. These fine-scale details reinforce the larger picture of a dynamic climate system, in which long-term glacial rhythms govern the rise and fall of sea level, while shorter fluctuations shape the day-to-day conditions of swamp forests. The persistence of glacial-interglacial cycling through much of the Carboniferous gives the period a distinctive rhythm. Unlike greenhouse intervals when polar regions remained ice-free, the Carboniferous is marked by repeated advances and retreats of ice over tens of millions of years. The regularity of cyclothems across wide regions demonstrates the strength of this signal. The combined influence of orbital variations, continental arrangement, and feedbacks from vegetation and atmospheric composition created a climate system of remarkable complexity. The result is a stratigraphic record filled with repeating patterns that remain some of the clearest windows into the interaction of tectonics, climate, and life in Earth's history. In the equatorial belt of the Carboniferous world, vast lowlands become the setting for immense peat-forming wetlands. These wetlands develop where rivers overflow their banks, where coastal plains remain waterlogged, and where the water table lies persistently at or near the surface. In such conditions, plant material accumulates faster than it decomposes. Warm temperatures and high rainfall provide constant growth, while poor drainage limits oxygen in the soil. Without oxygen, microbial activity slows, and dead plants accumulate in thick mats of peat. Over time, these mats can reach several meters in thickness, before being buried under sediments that seal and preserve them. The burial and compression of these peats, through geologic time, generate the great coal seams for which the Carboniferous is renowned. The structure of a Carboniferous swamp forest differs markedly from modern forests. The canopy is dominated by lycopsid trees, tall plants with simple branching and crowns of leaves at the tips of straight trunks. Their bark is patterned with diamond-shaped scars left by shed leaves, and their reproductive organs are borne in cones at the ends of branches. Below these giant stands of horsetails grow in dense clusters, with hollow stems segmented into nodes and whorls of branches. Seed ferns extend large fronds that spread outward, and true ferns fill shaded understories. Together, these groups create a multi-layered vegetation system, each adapted to wet and unstable soils. Rivers meander through these swamps, and their shifting channels shape the distribution of plant communities. Where levees form along channels, drier conditions allow seed ferns and small trees to thrive. In lower-lying depressions, permanent saturation favours lycopsids that root with broad, spreading systems. Flood events deposit layers of silt and sand across the swamp surface, sometimes killing vegetation, but also burying peat layers and protecting them from oxidation. Over thousands of years, this interplay of growth, death, flooding, and burial produces thick packages of alternating coal and clastic sediment. The chemistry of swamp water is equally important. Stagnant water rich in organic acids limits the activity of decay organisms. Fungi capable of breaking down lignin, one of the key components of woody tissue, are rare or absent in these settings during much of the Carboniferous. As a result, trunks, branches, and leaves accumulate with little decomposition. The low pH and anoxic conditions preserve delicate plant structures that are later fossilized with remarkable detail. Fossil assemblages from coal balls, limestone concretions that form within peat provide anatomically preserved plants including cell structures, spores, and reproductive organs. These fossils allow scientists to reconstruct entire swamp ecosystems with precision. The distribution of coal swamps follows tectonic and climatic patterns. Equatorial basins formed by subsidence provide space for thick accumulations of peat. Subsidence ensures that peat remains near the surface within the zone of plant growth, while at the same time creating accommodation for new material. Climate supplies continuous moisture and warmth. The combination of tectonic setting and climate regime makes the Carboniferous unique in its scale of coal formation. While coal exists in other periods, no other interval produces seams as extensive and numerous as those of this time. Coal seams preserve more than just plants. Within the sediments that cap or underlie them, fossils of amphibians, insects, and other animals appear. Trackways on mud surfaces show where creatures walked along swamp margins. Aquatic organisms left impressions in fine silts deposited in shallow ponds. Even microbial mats sometimes left textures in the sediment. Each coal seam is therefore not just a record of peat accumulation, but a snapshot of a complex ecosystem frozen in time. The transformation of peat to coal follows a slow pathway of burial and chemical change. As layers of sediment accumulate above a peat deposit, pressure compacts the material. Water and volatile components are expelled, and the proportion of carbon increases. Early stages produce lignite, a soft brown coal. With deeper burial and greater heat, lignite becomes bituminous coal, darker and more compact. At still greater depth and pressure, it can transform into anthracite, hard and shiny with high carbon content. These stages represent a continuum, each reflecting the degree of metamorphism experienced by the original peat. The Carboniferous contains deposits ranging from lignite to anthracite, depending on regional tectonic history and burial depth. The stratigraphic context of coal seams is consistent across continents. They typically occur within cyclothems bounded below and above by marine or non-marine sediments. A common sequence includes marine limestone at the base, followed by shale sandstone, a coal seam, and then limestone again. This pattern repeats many times. The position of the coal within this sequence reflects the balance between peat accumulation in lowland swamps and sea level change driven by glacial cycles. During regression, swamps expand peat forms and coal is preserved. During transgression, seas return burying the peat under marine sediments. This rhythmic alternation links the fate of equatorial forests to the ice sheets of Gondwana thousands of kilometers away. The fossils within coal balls provide extraordinary insights into Carboniferous plant life. Unlike compressions or impressions that flatten plant remains, coal balls preserve tissues in 3 dimensions. Thin sections cut from coal balls reveal cellular details of stems, roots, and reproductive organs. From these, scientists learn about the anatomy of extinct plants, their growth patterns, and their reproductive strategies. Lycopsids, for example, are shown to reproduce with spores produced in cones, while seed ferns reveal early development of ovules. Such anatomical evidence demonstrates the diversity and complexity of Carboniferous vegetation. The coal swamps also serve as habitats for early animals. Amphibians make use of shallow pools and damp ground for breeding. Their fossils appear in sediments associated with coal seams, sometimes as articulated skeletons, sometimes as isolated bones. Insects and other arthropods thrive among the dense vegetation, leaving behind wings, body parts, and trace fossils. The high productivity of swamp forests provides ample food and shelter, supporting diverse communities. These organisms depend on the stability of swamp environments, which in turn depend on the balance between sedimentation, subsidence, and water level. From a geochemical perspective, the burial of large amounts of organic carbon in coal swamps has consequences for the atmosphere. By locking carbon in sediments, these swamps contribute to changes in atmospheric composition, including elevated oxygen levels documented during the Carboniferous. Charcoal layers preserved within some coal-bearing strata indicate that wildfires occurred supported by high oxygen concentrations that made plant matter more combustible. These fires also influenced the structure of forests, opening gaps for new growth and contributing charcoal to the sedimentary record. Peat formation, coal accumulation, fossil preservation, and global feedbacks all converge in the equatorial swamps of the Carboniferous. Each element reflects the interaction of climate tectonics, biology, and chemistry. The peatlands spread widely across tropical continents, filling basins with organic, rich deposits that later transformed into coal seams stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Their persistence over millions of years makes them one of the most distinctive features of this period. Forests of the Carboniferous are dominated by towering lycopsids, a group of plants that differ greatly from any trees alive today. These plants, though not true trees in the modern sense, grow to heights of more than 30 meters. Their trunks are unbranched columns covered with diamond-shaped leaf scars, and their crowns consist of radiating tufts of leaves at the very top. The structural support of these giants comes not from dense wood, but from thick outer bark that encloses a relatively small core of conducting tissue. This anatomy allows rapid vertical growth in soft, swampy soils, but leaves the plants vulnerable to collapse once reproduction is complete. The life cycle of lycopsids is unusual. They reproduce with spores rather than seeds. Large cones at the ends of branches contain specialized leaves that produce spores of 2 types, a larger female spore and a smaller male spore. This system, called heterospory, represents an evolutionary step towards seed plants. The cones of some lycopsids are preserved in detail, showing how spores were released to fall onto the wet ground or into shallow water where fertilization could occur. The rooting systems of these plants are equally distinctive. Known as stigmarian systems, they spread laterally through the swamp substrate with radial branches that extend outward like spokes of a wheel. From these branches arise numerous fine rootlets that anchor the plant in waterlogged soil. Fossilized stigmarian axes appear in situ within many coal seams, sometimes still surrounded by the rootlets that penetrated the ancient mud. Their abundance demonstrates how these structures stabilized enormous trunks in unstable ground. The bark of Lycopsids forms another striking feature. Its thick outer layer contains tissues rich in resistant compounds that slow decay. When trunks fall into swamps, the bark persists long after the softer inner tissues decay. As a result, many coal deposits preserve bark fragments in abundance. In some cases, the bark itself compresses into coal, while the decayed interior collapses, leaving characteristic molds and casts in the rock record. These preservation patterns allow geologists to identify Lycopsid remains even when original anatomy is lost. Lycopsids dominate canopy positions in Carboniferous swamps, but their dominance is not permanent. Their reproductive strategy involves rapid growth production of large cones and then death of the trunk. Entire stands may die after reproduction, leaving open ground for new seedlings. This pattern creates a dynamic forest structure where patches of young and old individuals coexist. Fossil forests preserved in growth position reveal regular spacing of trunks, suggesting dense stands similar to modern plantations. Such arrangements influence the microclimate of swamps by shading the understory and by controlling humidity near the ground. Spores of Lycopsids are abundant in Carboniferous sediments. Their tough walls resist decay, and they disperse widely through water and wind. Palynological studies show that Lycopsid spores dominate many coal-bearing deposits, confirming the overwhelming importance of these plants in equatorial forests. Differences in spore types allow scientists to distinguish among genera and to track changes in forest composition over time. These microscopic records complement the larger-scale fossils of trunks, roots, and cones found in situ. The anatomy of Lycopsids also offers clues to their physiology. The limited amount of vascular tissue suggests that water transport was less efficient than in later seed plants. Their rapid vertical growth may have been an adaptation to compete for light in crowded swamps, achieved at the cost of structural longevity. The reliance on spores ties reproduction to moist environments, reinforcing the link between Lycopsid forests and permanently wet conditions. Their success during the Carboniferous reflects the coincidence of appropriate climate tectonic setting and ecological niche. Alongside their ecological role, Lycopsids play a critical part in the formation of coal. Their bark contributes large amounts of resistant organic matter to peat. Their massive rooting systems help trap sediment and stabilize swamp surfaces, preserving peat beneath. Their periodic mass die-offs create pulses of organic accumulation. In this way, the very biology of Lycopsids shapes the geological record. Fossil forests reveal trunks preserved upright, still rooted in their stigmarian systems. These sites provide rare glimpses into the structure of Carboniferous ecosystems. At some localities, entire stands of Lycopsids are buried rapidly by flooding events, sealing them in growth position. Such preservations allow reconstructions of spacing height and community composition that go beyond isolated specimens. They confirm that Lycopsid trees were not solitary giants, but parts of dense forests stretching across equatorial lowlands. The dominance of Lycopsids does not exclude other plants, but their towering presence defines the visual and ecological character of Carboniferous swamps. In addition to their towering form, Lycopsids influence soils and sediments around them. Their roots aerate shallow substrates, and their fallen trunks create microhabitats for smaller plants and animals. Decomposition is slow, so dead material lingers on the swamp floor. This accumulation of woody debris alters hydrology by impeding water flow and trapping sediments. Over time, these interactions create a feedback system where vegetation and sedimentation shape each other. The global spread of Lycopsid forests during the Carboniferous demonstrates how a single plant group can dominate ecosystems under favorable conditions. Their eventual decline in later periods highlights the transient nature of such dominance, but within the Carboniferous their role is unmatched. The remains of their trunks, bark, roots, and spores fill coal seams and associated sediments, preserving a detailed record of their biology and ecology. Their success illustrates how evolutionary innovations, environmental conditions, and geological processes converge to create landscapes that persist for millions of years. Beneath the canopy of towering leucopsids, other plant groups spread widely through the swamp forests of the Carboniferous. Seed ferns known as pteridosperms are among the most prominent. Though they resemble true ferns in the shape of their fronds, they reproduce with seeds rather than spores. Their large fronds extend several meters, branching into pinnae that capture sunlight filtering through the overstory. Seeds of pteridosperms are preserved in coal balls and compressions, revealing protective coats and structures for nourishment. This adaptation frees them from the strict reliance on moist conditions for reproduction, allowing colonization of drier microhabitats within swamp environments. They grow on levees, raised banks along rivers, and in areas where soils are less permanently waterlogged. Their presence marks a step toward the diversification of seed plants that will later reshape terrestrial floras. Horsetails belonging to the group Psephinopsids also flourish during this period. The genus Calamites forms tree-sized plants with hollow segmented stems. Their nodes bear whorls of branches and leaves, giving them a distinctive brush-like appearance. They grow in dense thickets along river margins and disturbed ground where frequent flooding and sediment deposition create open space. Underground rhizomes spread horizontally, producing new shoots and allowing rapid colonization. Their ability to resprout from rhizomes makes them resilient to disturbance, and fossil evidence shows that they quickly reoccupy areas scoured by channels or buried by fresh sediment. Their stems contain a central canal and supporting tissues that permit rapid growth in height. Preserved casts of these canals appear in sandstones where stems decayed and were filled by sediment. True ferns also play an important role in the understory. Their fronds are more delicate than those of seed ferns, and they reproduce with spores that require moist conditions. They thrive in shaded areas beneath larger plants, filling niches where light is limited but humidity remains high. Fossil fronds, often preserved as impressions in shale, show a remarkable diversity of forms. Fern spores are abundant in palynological records, marking their widespread distribution. While they remain subordinate in canopy height, their persistence demonstrates the stability of spore-based reproduction in constantly wet environments. Smaller leucopsids, distinct from the towering canopy forms, also grow in these forests. They reach only a few meters in height and fill gaps in the vegetation. Their simple morphology and reliance on spores tie them to moist microhabitats. Alongside them grow early chordates, primitive relatives of conifers. These plants bear strap-shaped leaves and produce seeds enclosed in cup-like structures. They occupy drier sites at the margins of swamps, foreshadowing the spread of gymnosperms in later periods. Their anatomy, preserved in coal balls, shows vascular tissues more efficient than those of leucopsids, allowing greater control of water transport. The layering of vegetation in Carboniferous swamps creates complex habitats. The canopy consists of leucopsids and tree-sized horsetails. Mid-levels are filled with seed ferns and smaller leucopsids. The understory contains ferns and ground cover plants. This vertical structure influences light, humidity, and soil conditions. Shade-loving species grow beneath dense crowns, while sun-demanding plants exploit openings created by fallen trunks or mass die-offs. Fossil forests preserved in situ capture this diversity with stumps, roots, and fallen stems, showing the arrangement of different species within the same stand. Reproduction strategies among these plants vary. Lycopsids and horsetails rely on spores limiting them to perpetually moist settings. Seed ferns and early chordates, by contrast, produce seeds that protect embryos and allow survival during drier intervals. This difference reflects a gradual shift in terrestrial ecosystems from dependence on water for fertilization toward independence through seed production. The coexistence of both strategies in the Carboniferous demonstrates a transitional stage in plant evolution. Each strategy has advantages under particular conditions, and the mosaic of swamp habitats supports both simultaneously. The sediments associated with plant remains provide additional information about their environment. Sandstones with cross-bedding mark channels that cut through forests, preserving casts of horsetail stems or impressions of leaves. Shales contain delicate fronds pressed flat, sometimes with spores still attached. Coal balls preserve three-dimensional anatomy, allowing the study of xylem vessels, reproductive structures, and even cellular details. Together, these preservation modes create a comprehensive record unmatched for most other periods of Earth history. They allow reconstruction of entire ecosystems with unusual precision. Palynology. The study of spores and pollen adds further insight. Different plant groups produce distinct microfossils. Lycopsid spores are large and ornamented horsetail spores are small and spherical, with elater's fern spores vary widely, and seed ferns yield pollen-like grains. These microfossils are transported by wind and water, settling into sediments far from their source. As a result, they provide regional records of vegetation, not just local snapshots. Sequences of spores in sedimentary layers show how plant communities shift, in step with climate and sea level changes. Peaks in Lycopsid spores correspond to humid intervals with extensive swamps, while increases in seed plant pollen indicate expansion during drier phases. The diversity of plants in Carboniferous swamps also shapes soil development. Root systems penetrate mud and stabilize surfaces, slowing erosion. In waterlogged settings, roots create anoxic zones that promote peat accumulation. In better drained soils, root activity produces paleosols with characteristic horizons. Fossil roots preserved in these paleosols document the presence of vegetation even when trunks and leaves are absent. The distribution of paleosols alongside coal seams and sandstones reflects the shifting mosaic of environments through time. Interactions among plants further influence ecosystem dynamics. Dense stands of horsetails prevent erosion along channel margins. Fallen Lycopsid trunks provide substrates for ferns to colonize. Seed ferns with their seeds capable of germinating away from constant moisture occupy levees and higher ground. These interactions create a patchwork of habitats within a single swamp complex. Fossil evidence supports this view, as assemblages from different sites show varying combinations of species depending on local conditions. The presence of such varied vegetation highlights the complexity of Carboniferous ecosystems. Rather than uniform expanses of a single plant type, the swamps contain diverse assemblages structured by microtopography, water level, and disturbance history. Floods, fires, and mass die-offs open space for succession, while continuous growth and accumulation of organic matter build peat layers. This interplay of stability and disturbance produces the distinctive coal-bearing sequences of the Carboniferous. The combination of Lycopsid giants, seed ferns, horsetails, ferns, and chordates defines the plant communities of this period and leaves a lasting imprint in the rock record. The atmosphere of the Carboniferous carries conditions unlike those of most other intervals in Earth history. Evidence suggests that oxygen concentrations reach levels significantly higher than in the present, with estimates ranging from more than 30% to even higher in some models. This enrichment arises from the burial of vast amounts of organic carbon in coal swamps. When peat accumulates and is buried, carbon is locked away in sediments instead of returning to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. The imbalance between photosynthesis and decomposition results in a net increase of oxygen. Fossil charcoal provides a direct line of evidence for high oxygen. Charcoal forms when plant material burns but is not consumed completely. Its abundance in Carboniferous deposits indicates that wildfires occurred frequently, since high oxygen levels make vegetation more easily ignited and allow fires to spread even in humid conditions. Microscopic analysis of fossil charcoal fragments reveals plant tissue structure preserved in blackened detail, confirming that ancient forests burned repeatedly. The role of fungi and microbes in decomposition also affects atmospheric composition. Many Carboniferous fungi lack the enzymatic pathways to efficiently break down lignin, a complex component of plant cell walls. Without this capability, large volumes of woody tissue accumulate in swamps rather than being decomposed and recycled. This incomplete decay enhances peat preservation and contributes to long-term carbon burial. Later in Earth history, when white rot fungi evolved the ability to decompose lignin, the balance changes. But in the Carboniferous, the limitation of decay pathways favours oxygen build-up in the air and coal accumulation in sediments. Geochemical proxies support the interpretation of elevated oxygen. Ratios of isotopes in marine carbonates and organic matter reveal fluctuations in global carbon cycling consistent with enhanced burial. Sulfur isotope records also reflect changes in redox balance. Independent modelling based on these proxies produces estimates of atmospheric oxygen well above present-day levels. Although exact percentages remain debated, the consensus holds that the Carboniferous represents one of the most oxygen-rich times in Earth history. High oxygen levels have biological consequences. Arthropods, which breathe through tracheal tubes that deliver oxygen directly to tissues, can grow larger when oxygen is abundant. Fossils of millipedes more than 2 meters long, dragonflies with wingspans of more than half a meter, and other oversized arthropods appear in Carboniferous strata. These remarkable sizes are consistent with the idea that higher oxygen availability permits diffusion to function effectively even in large bodies. At the same time, not all scientists agree on the extent of this effect. Some argue that ecological factors such as reduced predation or abundant food may also contribute. Nonetheless, the coincidence of giant arthropods with high oxygen remains striking. The elevated oxygen content also influences wildfire frequency. Even moist vegetation ignites more readily under enriched oxygen, and fires can sustain themselves with greater intensity. Charcoal layers interbedded with coal seams provide a record of repeated burning. In some deposits, the frequency of these layers suggests that wildfires were a common part of Carboniferous ecosystems. Such fires may have opened gaps in forests, promoting regeneration and maintaining diversity. The presence of fire-adapted traits in some plants, such as thick bark, hints at ecological responses to this fire-prone world. Respiration rates in animals also respond to oxygen concentration. Amphibians and early reptiles with less efficient respiratory systems may have benefited from abundant oxygen, allowing them to thrive in swampy environments. Conversely, extremely high oxygen levels could increase susceptibility to oxidative stress. Physiological adaptations would have been necessary to balance the advantages and risks. These subtler biological effects remain topics of study, and while the fossil record shows patterns consistent with oxygen, influence details of physiology remain inferred rather than directly observed. The interplay between coal formation, oxygen enrichment and climate feedbacks links biosphere and atmosphere tightly. As oxygen rises, more fires occur, returning carbon dioxide to the air and counteracting some of the drawdown. As peat accumulates, oxygen continues to build. This balance produces fluctuations in composition rather than a steady rise. The rhythm of these feedbacks is preserved in alternating coal shale and charcoal-bearing layers that together tell the story of atmospheric change. Scientists reconstructing these patterns use multiple methods. Geochemical analyses of iron formations, sulfur isotopes, and organic carbon yield insights into redox conditions. Charcoal abundance provides direct evidence of fire activity. Modeling of carbon and oxygen cycles incorporates burial rates, volcanic input, and weathering feedbacks. These models are tested against stratigraphic records from different continents, producing consistent signals of high oxygen during the Carboniferous. The unusual atmosphere also alters the chemistry of soils and waters. Elevated oxygen enhances weathering rates on land, producing thick soil profiles rich in iron oxides. Streams and rivers carry oxidized material into basins, influencing sediment color and mineralogy. Red beds formed under oxidizing conditions appear interbedded with coal measures recording intervals when drier conditions and oxygen-rich air favored soil development. In aquatic settings, oxygen penetrates deeper into water columns, supporting diverse communities of invertebrates in shallow seas. The presence of widespread fire is not just an incidental byproduct, but a key ecological force. Burned vegetation contributes charcoal to sediments, some of which becomes part of coal seams. Charcoal is resistant to decay, so it locks away carbon for millions of years. This further contributes to oxygen accumulation, reinforcing the feedback loop. Fossil charcoal layers serve as time markers, correlating across regions and indicating synchronous fire events tied to atmospheric composition. Although the broad outline is clear, uncertainties remain. Estimates of exact oxygen percentages vary, and not all proxies align perfectly. Some deposits show abundant charcoal, while others contain little, raising questions about regional variation in fire frequency. Fossil sizes suggest high oxygen, but cannot alone confirm precise values. Ongoing studies aim to refine models by integrating diverse data sets. Despite uncertainties, the Carboniferous atmosphere stands out as distinct, with oxygen levels high enough to shape ecosystems, drive fires, and leave lasting imprints in rock and fossil records. The linkage between oxygen and life in the Carboniferous demonstrates the sensitivity of Earth systems to feedbacks between biology and chemistry. Swamp forests produce peat burial raises, oxygen high. Oxygen encourages fires, fires alter vegetation and sediments, and the cycle continues. Each component reinforces or moderates the others, creating a dynamic equilibrium that persists for millions of years. The extraordinary conditions of this atmosphere underpin many of the unique features of Carboniferous ecosystems, from the structure of forests to the size of arthropods and the frequency of wildfires. Insects of the Carboniferous represent some of the earliest animals to master flight, and their evolution leaves a permanent mark on terrestrial ecosystems. Before this period, arthropods were confined to crawling, swimming or gliding short distances, but during the Carboniferous true powered flight appears. Fossil wings preserved in shales and sandstones reveal a variety of venation patterns, from simple to highly branched. Among the most striking are the giant dragonfly-like insects known as griffin flies with wingspans that exceed 1/2 a meter. These predatory insects likely patrolled above swamp forests and wetlands, feeding on smaller arthropods. The development of flight allows insects to exploit new ecological niches, dispersing widely escaping predators and colonizing habitats far from their points of origin. The tracheal breathing system of insects places physical limits on body size since oxygen diffuses directly through tubes rather than being pumped by lungs. Under present atmospheric conditions, this system constrains maximum size. In the Carboniferous, however, elevated oxygen concentrations allow diffusion to work more effectively. As a result, insects grow to sizes unmatched in later times. Millipedes, such as Arthropleura, reach lengths of more than 2 meters, and dragonflies achieve wingspans that dwarf modern relatives. These sizes are documented through both body fossils and trackways preserved in fine sediments. The coincidence of giant arthropods with oxygen-rich air supports the view that atmospheric composition is a key factor enabling their growth. Not all insects of the Carboniferous are giants. Many are small forms adapted to specialized niches within swamp forests. Cockroach-like insects appear in abundance, their flattened bodies suited for life in leaf litter and under bark. Orthopteran relatives with elongated hind legs evolve the ability to jump, taking advantage of open ground patches in wetlands. Early mayflies and relatives of stoneflies inhabit aquatic environments, their larvae living in streams and ponds. The variety of forms demonstrates rapid diversification soon after the origin of wings filling ecological roles in both terrestrial and freshwater systems. The mechanics of insect wings reveal significant experimentation during this time. Fossil wings show different modes of articulation and venation, suggesting multiple solutions to the challenges of flight. Some insects possess 2 pairs of wings of similar size flapping together. Others evolve mechanisms to link the forewings and hindwings, improving efficiency. Over time, these innovations contribute to the success of insect groups that continue into later periods. The presence of well-developed flight structures in Carboniferous fossils indicates that the origin of flight must have occurred earlier, perhaps in the late Devonian, but it is in the Carboniferous that insects truly expand into aerial ecosystems. The impact of flight on ecosystems is profound. Flying insects can transport spores and pollen, influencing plant reproduction. Though true pollination by insects evolves later, the potential for incidental transport of reproductive material exists. Flight also changes predator-prey dynamics. Aerial predators such as large dragonflies can capture prey on the wing, while flight gives smaller insects the ability to escape ground-based threats. This new dimension of movement adds complexity to ecosystems already rich in plant and animal diversity. Fossil deposits of the Carboniferous preserve insect diversity in detail. Lagerstätten sites of exceptional preservation yield impressions of delicate wings, bodies, and even fine structures such as antennae. These fossils come from shale deposits laid down in quiet water, where fine mud sealed organisms before decay. In some coal ball deposits, insect fragments are preserved alongside plant tissues, giving context to their habitats. The study of these fossils reveals patterns of community composition, showing which groups were abundant and how they changed through time. Trackways and feeding traces provide additional evidence of insect activity. On mud surfaces, shallow grooves record the movement of arthropods across swamp floors. Chewed plant fragments with characteristic patterns of damage suggest herbivory, though most early insects appear to be detritivories or predators rather than specialized plant feeders. The gradual increase of herbivory through the Carboniferous sets the stage for more complex plant-insect interactions in later periods. The ecological role of insects extends beyond flight. Detritivorous insects contribute to decomposition by consuming dead plant matter, though their impact is limited by the lack of fungi capable of breaking down lignin. Predatory insects regulate populations of smaller arthropods, and aquatic larvae participate in nutrient cycling within streams and ponds. Their presence in diverse habitats indicates that insects become integral parts of both terrestrial and freshwater food webs during the Carboniferous. The diversity of insect mouthparts preserved in fossils shows a range of feeding strategies. Some possess simple chewing mandibles suited for processing plant detritus. Others develop piercing or sucking structures, hinting at predation or fluid feeding. These variations demonstrate early experimentation with ecological roles, many of which persist in later insect lineages. Each adaptation represents a step toward the extraordinary diversity that insects achieve in subsequent geologic periods. Wing venation patterns provide key data for classification and evolutionary study. Branching veins strengthen wings and influence flight dynamics. Differences in venation are so consistent that paleontologists use them to distinguish species and higher taxa. The fine preservation of Carboniferous wings allows detailed analysis, enabling reconstruction of insect phylogeny at an early stage of their history. Such studies show that major lineages of winged insects are already established by this time, even if their descendants will continue to diversify. Insect fossils also serve as indicators of environmental conditions. The abundance of aquatic larvae points to widespread freshwater habitats in swamps and floodplains. The size of giant forms supports interpretations of high atmospheric oxygen. The distribution of species across continents provides data on paleogeography, as some groups occur in both North America and Europe, consistent with their connection in Laurussia. Together, these signals make insects valuable tools for reconstructing the Carboniferous world. Though details of their behavior cannot be directly observed, comparisons with modern relatives suggest certain ecological roles. Dragonflies with their strong wings and large eyes are likely aerial hunters. Cockroach-like insects may have lived in colonies feeding on decaying matter. Aquatic larvae probably filtered food from water or scraped surfaces for organic films. Each of these roles contributes to the complexity of swamp ecosystems, where energy flows through intricate networks of producers, consumers, and decomposers. The emergence of insect flight also alters evolutionary trajectories of other animals. Amphibians and early reptiles share swamp habitats with insects, and flying prey provides new food sources. Birds and bats will not appear until much later, but in the Carboniferous, large amphibians and reptiles may have exploited grounded or resting insects. This interplay between groups adds further layers to ecological interactions, showing how one innovation can reverberate through entire ecosystems. The legacy of Carboniferous insects lies not only in their fossils, but also in the evolutionary pathways they establish. By colonizing the air, insects open a new realm of ecological opportunity. Their size diversity and abundance in this period demonstrate the unique conditions of the time, particularly high oxygen levels and extensive swamp environments. These factors combine to produce insect faunas unlike any seen before or since preserved in the rocks, as testimony to a world both alien and foundational to later life. Among the most remarkable inhabitants of the Carboniferous swamps are the giant arthropods that thrive in conditions supported by the unique atmosphere and ecosystems of the time. Arthropleura, an immense millipede relative, reaches lengths of more than 2 meters, making it the largest known land invertebrate in Earth history. Fossil trackways show the parallel impressions of dozens of legs moving in coordination across damp surfaces. These trackways appear in sandstones and shales deposited on floodplains and deltic margins, indicating that Arthropleura roamed widely through lowland habitats. Its size is consistent with elevated atmospheric oxygen which allows the tracheal breathing system of arthropods to support much larger body volumes than under present-day conditions. The diet of Arthropleura is inferred from its anatomy and fossil context. Its jaws and mouth parts suggest detritivore feeding on decaying plant matter, though some hypotheses allow for opportunistic omnivory. The abundance of dead vegetation in swamp forests provides ample food, and the lack of large terrestrial vertebrate predators allows Arthropleura to dominate its ecological niche without strong competition. The sheer presence of such a giant invertebrate highlights the unusual nature of Carboniferous ecosystems. Another iconic giant of the period is the dragonfly-like insect Meganeura. With wingspans reaching 70 centimeters, Meganeura is among the largest insects to have ever lived. Its fossils reveal large compound eyes, strong mandibles and powerful wings, features suited to an aerial predator. It likely hunted other insects above the swamp canopy, filling a role later occupied by birds and bats in different eras. The flight of such an insect is possible only in an atmosphere with high oxygen content and dense air conditions well established by geochemical and fossil evidence for the Carboniferous. Meganeura represents not just a curiosity of size, but a successful adaptation that flourished in aerial ecosystems sustained by the unique atmospheric chemistry of the time. Scorpion spiders and other arachnids also diversify and increase in size during the Carboniferous. Fossil scorpions reach lengths of more than half a meter, and some may have retained aquatic or semi-aquatic habits before fully adapting to land. Spiders appear with simple body forms spinning silk, but lacking the complex webs of modern groups. These arachnids occupy niches as predators of smaller arthropods, their large size again linked to atmospheric conditions and ecological opportunity. Their fossils occur in terrestrial sediments, associated with coal seams sometimes preserved as impressions showing body segmentation and appendages. The arthropod giants do not exist in isolation. Their communities include smaller relatives that share similar adaptations. Millipedes of moderate size, centipedes with elongated bodies and venomous fangs, and diverse insects all coexist, creating a layered arthropod fauna. This diversity reflects both the productivity of Carboniferous forests and the absence of vertebrate predators that will later constrain arthropod size. In these ecosystems, arthropods serve as herbivores, detritivores, and predators cycling energy through multiple pathways. Trackways preserved in fine-grained sediments provide direct evidence of arthropod behavior. Parallel rows of footprints record the passage of Arthropleura across soft mud. Smaller sets of tracks reveal centipedes and spiders moving across the same surfaces. Some trackways intersect, showing that these animals shared habitats and moved through the same landscapes. Such ichnofossils complement body fossils, offering glimpses of activity otherwise invisible in the record. Their distribution across Europe and North America confirms that giant arthropods are widespread in equatorial regions of the Carboniferous. The influence of these large arthropods on ecosystems is significant. As detritivores giants such as Arthropleura process enormous volumes of plant litter, contributing to nutrient cycling and soil development. Predatory insects like Meganeura regulate populations of smaller arthropods, shaping community dynamics. Arachnids expand terrestrial food webs by adding new levels of predation. Together, these roles illustrate the integration of arthropod giants into swamp ecosystems, not as isolated anomalies but as functional members of complex communities. The preservation of giant arthropods is aided by specific conditions. Rapid burial in fine sediments after floods protects bodies and trackways from erosion. Anoxic conditions in swamp deposits slow decay and allow delicate features to survive. Coal balls occasionally entomb insect wings, preserving venation patterns that document flight structures in detail. The rarity of complete skeletons reflects the fragility of arthropod exoskeletons, but the abundance of fragmentary remains and trace fossils provides a robust picture of their presence. Debate continues among scientists about the precise causes of arthropod gigantism. Elevated oxygen is the leading explanation, supported by physiological models of tracheal diffusion. Some researchers emphasize ecological factors such as reduced predation and abundant food supply. Others point to the absence of advanced vertebrate competitors as a window of opportunity. It is likely that a combination of these factors contributes with atmospheric composition, providing the necessary condition and ecological context, allowing expression of extreme sizes. Regardless of the cause, the outcome is a fauna of unprecedented scale that defines the Carboniferous. The interplay between fire frequency and arthropod life is another aspect under study. High oxygen promotes wildfires, which periodically clear forests and create open habitats. Such disturbances may favor certain arthropod groups that exploit detritus or colonize disturbed ground. Fossil assemblages sometimes contain charcoal alongside arthropod remains, linking their ecology directly to the fire-prone atmosphere of the time. These interactions underscore the tight coupling of physical and biological processes in Carboniferous ecosystems. The giants of the Carboniferous leave a legacy beyond their time. Their fossils inspire questions about physiological limits, ecological interactions, and atmospheric conditions. By studying their remains, scientists gain insight into the feedbacks between life and environment. The trackways of Arthropleura, the wings of Meganeura, and the bodies of large arachnids all testify to a world where the rules of size and adaptation differ from those of today. They represent a chapter in the history of life when atmospheric and ecological conditions align to allow extraordinary forms to flourish. Amphibians of the Carboniferous occupy a wide array of habitats, from shallow ponds and rivers to damp forest floors. Descended from Devonian ancestors that first ventured onto land, they diversify into numerous lineages during this period. Their bodies retain many features tied to aquatic life, including moist skin used for respiration and reproduction linked to water. Yet they also experiment with adaptations for living on land. Fossils show a range of sizes, from small salamander-like forms to large temnospondyls that reach lengths of several meters. These animals inhabit equatorial swamps where abundant insects and invertebrates provide a steady food source. Their skeletons, preserved in fine-grained mudstones near coal seams, record limbs robust enough for walking on land, but still associated with sprawling posture suited to life at the water's edge. Among the most significant developments in the Carboniferous is the appearance of early reptiles. Unlike amphibians, reptiles evolve amniote eggs, which enclose embryos in protective membranes and allow development away from standing water. This adaptation represents a major evolutionary step, freeing vertebrates from the constraint of breeding exclusively in aquatic settings. Fossils of early reptiles appear in Pennsylvanian deposits of North America, showing small lizard-like bodies with scales and well-ossified skeletons. Though modest in size, these reptiles establish a lineage that will eventually dominate terrestrial ecosystems. Their presence alongside amphibians illustrates a transitional world where both water-bound and water-independent strategies coexist. The diversity of amphibians in the Carboniferous is remarkable. Temnospondyls include large broad-headed predators with strong jaws and sharp teeth for feeding on fish and smaller amphibians. Lepospondyls are smaller forms with varied body plans, including eel-like swimmers and compact terrestrial walkers. Their vertebrae exhibit distinctive shapes that aid classification. Fossil trackways show amphibians moving across soft mud near swamps, leaving behind impressions of sprawling limbs and dragging tails. These traces confirm that amphibians are not confined to water, but actively explore terrestrial surfaces. Their ecological roles range from top predators in freshwater habitats to insectivores in forest floors. Early reptiles are less numerous but highly significant. The amniote egg allows colonization of drier habitats that amphibians cannot exploit. Reptile fossils occur in deposits representing floodplains and uplands adjacent to coal swamps. Their skeletons show stronger limb girdles and more advanced vertebral articulation, providing better support for terrestrial locomotion. Teeth with simple conical shapes suggest diets of insects and small vertebrates. Though small in number, these reptiles mark the beginning of a lineage that will expand dramatically in later periods. Their emergence underscores the evolutionary experimentation taking place within Carboniferous vertebrates. The ecosystems of this period offer abundant resources for vertebrates. Insects proliferate in swamp forests, providing food for amphibians and reptiles alike. Arthropod giants, though formidable leave remains that scavengers can exploit. Aquatic systems are rich in fish, crustaceans, and mollusks. Amphibians serve as both predators and prey, linking aquatic and terrestrial food webs. Reptiles begin to occupy drier microhabitats, reducing competition and opening new niches. This partitioning of resources contributes to the coexistence of diverse vertebrate groups. The fossil record preserves not only bones but also impressions of soft tissues and trackways that reveal behavior. In some deposits, articulated amphibian skeletons are found within floodplain sediments, suggesting rapid burial after sudden floods. Other sites preserve clusters of bones, possibly representing breeding or feeding grounds. Trackways show animals moving in groups or repeatedly using the same paths. These traces highlight the integration of vertebrates into dynamic swamp environments, where water levels and vegetation shift frequently. Comparisons of amphibians and reptiles reveal the importance of the amniote egg. Amphibians remain tied to water for reproduction. Eggs laid in ponds and streams are vulnerable to drying, predation, and environmental change. Reptiles, by enclosing embryos within protective membranes and shells, gain independence from these constraints. This difference shapes future evolutionary trajectories. In the Carboniferous, both groups coexist, but the long-term implications are clear. Reptiles open the pathway to colonization of uplands, deserts, and eventually every major terrestrial habitat. The presence of reptiles in Carboniferous deposits is supported by fragmentary but significant finds. Small skeletons show slender bodies, elongated tails, and well-developed claws. Their scales suggest protection against desiccation. The arrangement of skull bones indicates stronger jaw mechanics compared to amphibians. These features provide evidence of gradual refinement of terrestrial adaptations. Although reptiles remain small and limited in diversity, their innovations lay foundations for future dominance. The environments that support amphibians and reptiles are shaped by shifting coastlines and swamp development. During low sea level, broad plains emerge and rivers meander across them. Amphibians breed in pools left behind by floods, while reptiles forage on drier levees. During high sea level, swamps expand and amphibians dominate aquatic habitats, while reptiles retreat to elevated ground. This constant change maintains opportunities for both strategies. The alternation of conditions ensures that no single group monopolizes resources, fostering diversity within vertebrate faunas. The study of vertebrate fossils from this time relies on both macrofossils and microfossils. Bones and skulls provide anatomical details, while microfossils such as isolated teeth and scales appear in sediments sieved from coal measures. These small remains confirm the widespread presence of vertebrates, even in regions where complete skeletons are rare. Together they show that amphibians are abundant and reptiles already present, though still in early stages of radiation. The interplay of amphibians and reptiles within Carboniferous ecosystems illustrates the gradual nature of evolutionary change. Amphibians continue to dominate in terms of diversity and biomass, filling aquatic and semi-aquatic roles. Reptiles begin a slow but steady expansion into new territories. Both groups exploit the rich insect faunas and the varied habitats created by shifting swamps and rivers. Their fossils provide evidence of the adaptive experiments taking place as vertebrates explore the possibilities of life on land. The oceans of the Carboniferous hold ecosystems as rich and varied as the swamps on land. Shallow epicontinental seas cover broad areas of continental interiors, and in these waters carbonate platforms build up from the accumulation of skeletal remains. Crinoids dominate many seafloors, their stalked bodies rising upward and their feathery arms extended to capture particles from the water. Storms break their stalks, scattering disks that blanket the seabed. Over time, these fragments compact into thick limestones composed almost entirely of crinoid debris. Rugose corals with horn-shaped solitary cups grow on firm substrates, while tabulate corals form colonial mounds of closely packed coral lights. Bryozoans branch outward in fan-like shapes filtering suspended material. Brachiopods settle in dense clusters, some attaching by stalks and others resting freely on mud. Their shells, preserved in abundance, mark one of the most distinctive fossil assemblages of this time. In deeper or quieter waters, fine clay and silt accumulate, preserving delicate fossils of foraminifera and conodonts. Foraminifera, though microscopic, contribute significantly to carbonate sediments with their calcareous shells. Conodont animals leave tiny tooth-like elements, each less than a few millimeters, that serve as important tools for stratigraphic correlation. Their color changes with burial temperature, providing information on the thermal history of rocks. These microfossils, though small, hold major importance for reconstructing ancient environments and dating layers across continents. Fish lineages also diversify in Carboniferous seas. Sharks and relatives already established in earlier periods continue to expand. Fossils show large teeth suited for predation, as well as smaller forms adapted to bottom feeding. Early ray-finned fishes appear with scales and fin rays that foreshadow later radiations. Lobe-finned fishes persist but decline in diversity as new lineages expand. Placoderms, the armoured fishes that flourished in the Devonian, disappear early in the Carboniferous, leaving niches open for other groups. The marine vertebrate fauna of this period thus represents a transitional stage between earlier armoured fishes and later more modern assemblages. The structure of carbonate platforms reflects cycles of sea level change. During high stands, clear water allows extensive growth of carbonate-producing organisms. Limestones formed in these settings are thick, fossil-rich and laterally continuous. During low stands, clastic input from rivers increases, diluting carbonate production. Sandstones and shales replace limestones in the record. These alternations mirror the glacial-interglacial cycles driven by Gondwanan ice sheets, linking marine sedimentation to global climate rhythms. Storm deposits known as tempestites are common in Carboniferous limestones. They appear as graded beds containing shell fragments and crinoid debris transported by waves and currents. Between storms, fine carbonate mud settles, creating thin layers of micrite. The alternation of tempestites and micrite records the balance between episodic high-energy events and background sedimentation. Such features provide clues about water depth, storm intensity, and shelf position. By examining these deposits, geologists reconstruct the dynamics of ancient shallow seas. The distribution of fossils within marine sediments reveals ecological zoning, Nearshore areas support communities tolerant of variable salinity and sediment input. Brachiopods, mollusks and crinoids dominate these zones. Farther offshore, clearer waters host coral and bryozoan assemblages. In deeper settings, fine-grained sediments preserve microfossils rather than large skeletal remains. This zonation, consistent across multiple basins, shows that ecological structure in Carboniferous seas resembles modern marine zonation, though the dominant groups differ. Geochemical records from marine sediments provide insights into ocean chemistry. Ratios of carbon isotopes reflect the burial of organic matter in swamps, linking marine signals to terrestrial processes. Oxygen isotopes in carbonate shells record seawater temperature and global ice volume. Strontium isotopes trace the balance between continental weathering and volcanic activity. These records align with sedimentary and fossil evidence to build a coherent picture of interconnected marine and terrestrial systems. Reefs of the Carboniferous differ from modern coral reefs. Instead of being built primarily by scleractinian corals, which do not evolve until the Mesozoic Carboniferous reefs rely on rugose corals, tabulate corals and bryozoans with crinoids and sponges contributing. These reef structures are smaller and less continuous than modern tropical reefs, but provide important habitats. Fossil assemblages from these settings include diverse invertebrates, showing that even modest reef mounds support complex ecosystems. In some regions, evaporate deposits form, indicating restricted marine basins with high evaporation. Gypsum and halite layers record episodes when water circulation was limited and salinity increased. These deposits, interbedded with carbonates and shales, show that local environmental conditions varied greatly. While equatorial regions favored coal swamps on land, adjacent basins could alternate between open marine, restricted marine, and evaporitic states depending on sea level and geography. The fossil record also includes abundant trace fossils that document behavior in marine settings. Burrows in shale reveal the activity of worms and crustaceans. Trails and resting traces on bedding surfaces show where organisms moved or settled on soft sediment. Some burrows penetrate multiple layers, indicating prolonged occupation of stable substrates. Such traces complement skeletal fossils by providing evidence of interactions between organisms and sediment. Carboniferous seas thus support ecosystems structured by physical processes of sea level change, storm activity, and sediment input, as well as by biological interactions among invertebrates and fish. Their record in limestones, shales, and sandstones captures both the broad cycles of climate and the fine details of daily life on ancient seafloors. The abundance of crinoids, brachiopods, corals, foraminifera, and conodonts marks this period as one of exceptional productivity in shallow marine environments, linked closely to the global context of glaciation, atmospheric change, and continental assembly. The rock record of the Carboniferous contains repeating patterns that geologists call cyclothems, sequences of sedimentary layers that preserve the rhythm of changing environments. A typical cyclothem begins with marine limestone formed during times when epicontinental seas advance over lowlands. This is followed by shale deposited in quieter waters, sometimes rich in marine fossils. Sandstone layers appear above, representing deltas or river channels, prograding into the basin as sea level falls. Coal seams often rest atop these deposits, recording peat accumulation in swamps that spread across exposed plains. Another marine limestone then caps the sequence as sea level rises once again. The repetition of these layers creates thick successions that extend across continents, capturing the pulse of glacial interglacial cycles over millions of years. Cyclothems are not identical in every region. Some sequences contain thick limestones with abundant marine fossils, while others emphasize sandstones and coals. Variations depend on local subsidence sediment supply and proximity to uplands. Yet the general order of marine to non-marine to coal to marine again recurs with striking consistency. This pattern demonstrates that global sea level changes driven by Gondwanan ice sheets exert control across vast distances. The study of cyclothems allows geologists to correlate layers from different basins linking deposits in North America, Europe, and Asia into a single framework of glacially driven cycles. Within cyclothems, geologists find evidence of both gradual processes and sudden events. Limestones often preserve continuous records of marine life from crinoid beds to brachiopod shell pavements. Shales record quieter water, sometimes containing well-preserved fossils of delicate organisms. Sandstones show cross-bedding and ripple marks that indicate moving water and shifting channels. Coal seams preserve plant material in extraordinary detail, sometimes including upright stumps still rooted in place. Each layer tells a part of the story of environmental change, and together they form a sequence that can be read like a book of ancient climates. The thickness of cyclothems varies, but many are only a few meters from base to top. Stacked in succession, however, they form packages hundreds of meters thick. In some regions, dozens of cyclothems are preserved, each marking a glacial-interglacial cycle, lasting hundreds of thousands of years. These successions provide one of the best high-resolution records of climate variation in deep time. By counting and correlating cyclothems, geologists can estimate the periodicity of glacial cycles and compare them to astronomical forcing predicted by Milankovitch theory. The match between sedimentary cycles and orbital parameters strengthens the interpretation that Earth's orbit plays a role in driving Carboniferous climate rhythms. Paleosols are another key component of cyclothems. These fossil soils form during periods of landscape stability, when sea level is low and surfaces remain exposed long enough for soil horizons to develop. Root traces, soil structures, and geochemical signatures reveal whether conditions are humid, seasonally dry, or waterlogged. Gleed soils indicate saturation and reduction, while calcareous nodules point to evaporation and dryness. By studying paleosols within cyclothems, scientists reconstruct subtle changes in climate and vegetation beyond what coal and limestone alone can show. The alternation of coals, paleosols, and marine sediments demonstrates how ecosystems respond directly to glacial rhythms. Coal seams within cyclothems are often laterally extensive, stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Their continuity indicates widespread swamp formation across equatorial basins. Yet within these seams, thin partings of shale or silt show interruptions in peat accumulation, perhaps from floods, fires, or temporary marine incursions. Detailed studies of coal petrology reveal layering at scales as fine as annual growth cycles. Such details record local environmental fluctuations superimposed on broader climatic rhythms. The result is a record that combines fine resolution with global correlation. Marine fossils within cyclothems are also valuable for stratigraphy. Conodont elements, microscopic but abundant, provide precise dating and correlation across basins. Their color alteration indices also record burial temperatures, giving information about thermal history. Brachiopods, foraminifera, and corals add paleoecological context, showing which environments flourished during transgressions. By combining biostratigraphy with sedimentology, geologists build detailed reconstructions of how sea level, climate, and ecosystems interacted. The recognition of cyclothems has practical importance as well. Coal seams, oil shales, and natural gas accumulations often occur within these sequences. Understanding their distribution and correlation aids in resource exploration. Many of the world's coal fields are based on Carboniferous cyclothems, and their study has economic as well as scientific value. The predictability of coal seam position within sequences reflects the underlying rhythm of climate and sea level that governs their formation. The interpretation of cyclothems also raises questions about regional versus global controls. While glacial cycles in Gondwana provide the primary driver, local tectonics influence thickness and composition. Subsiding basins preserve thicker successions while uplifted areas record gaps. River systems deliver varying amounts of sediment depending on proximity to mountains. These local factors complicate correlation, but also provide insights into how global signals interact with regional geology. The interplay of global icehouse climate and regional tectonic setting shapes the final stratigraphic product. Some cyclothems contain unusual layers that record brief but important events. Ash beds thin but widespread preserve volcanic eruptions that dispersed material across continents. These tuffs provide radiometric dates that anchor the timescale of the Carboniferous. Fossil-rich horizons capture sudden blooms of marine life, possibly linked to changes in nutrient input or water chemistry. Unusual red beds indicate episodes of oxidation during dry intervals. Each anomaly within the otherwise regular rhythm adds texture to the story of Carboniferous environments. The global significance of cyclothems lies in their demonstration that Earth's systems are tightly linked. Ice sheets at southern latitudes control sea level in the tropics. Vegetation in equatorial swamps affects carbon burial and atmospheric composition. Marine organisms respond to changes in water depth and chemistry. Each component is preserved in layers that repeat with remarkable fidelity. The cyclothems of the Carboniferous stand as a clear record of the interaction between tectonics, climate, and life on a global scale. The accumulation of vast peat deposits during the Carboniferous depends not only on plant growth, but also on the limited efficiency of decomposition. In modern ecosystems, fungi and microbes rapidly recycle plant material, breaking down cellulose and lignin so that little accumulates. In the Carboniferous, however, many groups of decomposers lack the enzymatic pathways to fully degrade lignin, a complex polymer that provides strength to woody tissues. As a result, fallen trunks, branches, and leaves persist in swamps, slowly compacting into peat. The absence of efficient lignin decay acts as a biological bottleneck, diverting carbon away from the atmosphere and into sediments. This process plays a crucial role in shaping the global carbon and oxygen balance of the period. Coal balls, calcareous concretions that form within peat, provide direct evidence of how incomplete decay preserves plant tissues. Inside coal balls, cellular details remain intact, including xylem vessels, spores, and reproductive organs. Thin sections of coal balls show tissues of leucopsids, seed, ferns, and horsetails, preserved with extraordinary fidelity. The prevalence of such fossils indicates that peat often accumulated faster than it decayed. In many deposits, upright stumps with intact root systems remain in place, buried by sediment while still standing. These preserved forests show that entire communities could be entombed before decomposition had time to destroy their structure. The chemistry of swamp environments further slows decay. Waterlogged soils become anoxic, limiting microbial activity. Acidic conditions produced by organic acids in stagnant water also inhibit decomposers. Together, these factors create a setting where organic matter accumulates rapidly but decays slowly. Fires encouraged by high atmospheric oxygen occasionally sweep through swamps, but even burned material can persist as charcoal. Charcoal is resistant to microbial attack and often becomes incorporated into coal seams. Thus, both lack of lignin-decomposing fungi and the geochemical environment of swamps contribute to the preservation of plant material. The timing of when fungi evolve the ability to degrade lignin is significant. Molecular studies suggest that white rot fungi capable of this process appear later in the Permian or Triassic. If correct, their absence in the Carboniferous explains the unusual scale of coal formation. Without them, ecosystems lack a key feedback loop that normally recycles carbon. Instead, much of the carbon fixed by photosynthesis remains locked in sediments. This imbalance explains why atmospheric oxygen rises to unusually high levels, while carbon dioxide decreases. The carbon cycle of the Carboniferous is thus distinctive, shaped by the evolutionary stage of microbial decomposers. Evidence for limited decay also appears in the structure of coal seams. Many seams contain recognizable fragments of bark leaves and spores. In some cases, even cellular details remain visible under microscopes. These features would not persist if decay had been rapid and efficient. Instead, they show that plant remains entered sediments with minimal alteration. The layering within coal seams sometimes reflects original peat growth surfaces with distinct horizons of lycopsid bark, fern fronds, or seed fern tissues. Such stratification records the composition of forests at the time of burial frozen in organic layers. The slow decomposition of plant matter has broader consequences for ecosystem dynamics. Fallen trunks accumulate on swamp floors, creating physical barriers that alter water flow. Pools form behind these barriers, supporting aquatic organisms and influencing vegetation patterns. Soil development is affected as undecomposed organic matter builds thick horizons. Nutrient cycling slows since elements locked in woody tissue remain unavailable until buried or burned. These feedbacks create distinctive ecological conditions in Carboniferous swamps, different from those of later forests where decomposers recycle nutrients more efficiently. Geochemical studies of coal seams confirm the limited role of decay. High ratios of carbon to nitrogen reflect the preferential preservation of carbon-rich lignin and cellulose compared to nitrogen-rich proteins that decay more quickly. Trace elements also reveal signatures of stagnant water and reducing conditions. Sulfur content varies depending on marine influence, but in many inland seams it remains low, supporting the view that freshwater swamp conditions dominated. Such geochemical markers align with the fossil evidence of incomplete decomposition. The incomplete breakdown of lignin also influences sedimentary geochemistry on a larger scale. Burial of vast amounts of undecomposed organic matter removes carbon from short-term cycles, reducing greenhouse gases and contributing to a cooler climate. The feedback loop involves vegetation microbes, atmosphere, and climate all interacting through processes of growth, decay, and burial. Without decomposers able to recycle lignin, the system tips toward carbon sequestration. This helps explain why the Carboniferous remains one of the most significant intervals of coal formation in Earth history. Debate continues over how rapidly decomposition pathways evolve and spread. Some fossil evidence hints at limited fungal decay in certain localities, suggesting regional variation. Others argue that environmental factors alone, such as persistent waterlogging, may suffice to explain preservation. Yet the overwhelming scale of coal accumulation across multiple continents implies a more general limitation. Whether due to microbial evolution, geochemistry, or a combination, the outcome is clear. Plant material accumulates on a scale unmatched in later eras. Charcoal layers within Carboniferous sediments add complexity to this picture. Fires fueled by high oxygen occasionally burn forests and swamps. Instead of returning all carbon to the atmosphere, some of this burned material becomes preserved in sediments. Charcoal resists decay even more strongly than unburned wood, enhancing long-term carbon storage. Thus, fire paradoxically contributes to oxygen accumulation by locking away carbon in an inert form. The coexistence of widespread fires and incomplete microbial decay reinforces the unusual feedbacks of this period. The legacy of limited decomposition is visible not only in coal seams, but also in global atmospheric composition and climate. Elevated oxygen supports arthropod gigantism and frequent wildfires. Reduced carbon dioxide contributes to long-term glaciation in Gondwana. The distinctive rock record of the Carboniferous with its thick coals and rhythmic cyclothems is a direct outcome of these interactions. The absence of efficient lignin degradation sets the Carboniferous apart, making it unique in Earth history, as a time when biology and geochemistry combined to reshape the atmosphere on a planetary scale. Scientific study of the Carboniferous continues to reveal questions that remain unresolved, particularly concerning the timing and magnitude of atmospheric oxygen, highs the roles of decomposition processes, and the variability of climate across different regions. Estimates of oxygen concentration rely on indirect proxies such as charcoal abundance, isotopic ratios, and models of the carbon cycle. While most results suggest levels higher than today, perhaps exceeding 30%, the exact peak remains uncertain. Some models favor brief spikes, others propose sustained intervals, and still others suggest regional variation that complicates a simple global figure. The uncertainty stems from the difficulty of linking local evidence with global conditions. Charcoal, for example, is abundant in some deposits, but sparse in others, raising the possibility that fire regimes were not uniform worldwide. The role of microbial decomposition in shaping coal accumulation is another area of debate. Many scientists argue that the absence of lignin-degrading fungi explains why so much plant material persisted. Others point to geochemical conditions of swamps, noting that waterlogging and acidity alone could inhibit decay even without evolutionary constraints. Some evidence suggests limited lignin breakdown did occur, though not at the efficiency seen later. The balance between biological innovation and environmental control remains an open question. Resolving it requires integrating fossil evidence molecular data on fungal evolution and geochemical signals from coal and associated sediments. Regional differences in climate present further complexity. While equatorial zones supported vast swamps, higher latitudes experience glaciation, and intermediate regions may have fluctuated between wet and dry conditions. Red beds interbedded with coal measures suggest episodes of oxidation in some areas, while thick coals indicate persistent humidity in others. How these differences fit into a global climate framework is not yet fully clear. Some models emphasize strong monsoonal circulation driven by the configuration of continents. Others stress the importance of orbital cycles superimposed on long-term tectonic controls. The challenge is to reconcile detailed local records with broad-scale drivers, a task still ongoing in stratigraphic and climate research. The duration and extent of Gondwanan glaciations also remain under study. Evidence shows repeated advances and retreats of ice sheets, yet the precise timing and correlation between continents are debated. Dropstones and tillites appear in South America, Africa, and Antarctica, but aligning these records is difficult without precise dating. Some researchers propose that glaciation persisted continuously, with shifting centers of activity, while others suggest episodic glacial intervals separated by warmer phases. Understanding these patterns is critical for interpreting sea level changes and their impact on tropical cyclothems. Evolutionary questions also arise from the Carboniferous fossil record. The appearance of reptiles with amniote eggs represents a major transition, but the details of how this adaptation spread remain partly unclear. Fossils are sparse, and many are fragmentary, leaving gaps in the sequence. Similarly, the origin of insect flight is established by Carboniferous fossils, yet whether flight evolved once or multiple times is debated. Wing venation patterns suggest experimentation among lineages, but the evolutionary pathways are still being reconstructed. Arthropod gigantism raises additional questions. Elevated oxygen explains much of the pattern, but whether ecological release or predator absence also played roles is still considered. Marine ecosystems also leave open issues. Crinoids dominate many limestones, yet their population dynamics, reproductive strategies, and reasons for periodic declines are not fully resolved. Conodonts, though abundant as microfossils, remain enigmatic in terms of their complete biology. Their tooth-like elements provide excellent biostratigraphic tools, but the full anatomy of the animals is poorly represented. Coral communities show alternating abundance and decline, possibly tied to environmental stress or competition, but the drivers remain uncertain. The stratigraphic framework of the Carboniferous continues to be refined. Regional correlations using conodont zones, ammonoids, and foraminifera improve resolution, yet debates persist over precise boundary definitions between stages. Different continents preserve different successions, and aligning them requires careful calibration with radiometric dates. Volcanic ash beds within cyclothems offer potential for absolute dating, but these are not always present. As a result, uncertainties remain in the exact duration of certain intervals and in the correlation of global events. The role of fire in Carboniferous ecosystems is another active area of research. While charcoal confirms widespread burning, its ecological effects are debated. Did fire maintain diversity by opening canopies, or did it devastate forests periodically? Were fires more common during specific oxygen peaks? Or did local factors such as seasonality dominate studies of charcoal distribution, plant anatomy, and sedimentary context aim to answer these questions, but interpretations vary. Some evidence shows repeated fire horizons within coal measures, implying integration into ecosystem dynamics rather than catastrophic disruption. The global carbon cycle of the Carboniferous raises additional questions. Burial of organic carbon in coal deposits clearly influenced atmospheric composition, but the magnitude of its effect relative to other processes such as volcanic degassing and chemical weathering of rocks remains debated. Models of the carbon cycle vary in their estimates of fluxes, leading to different conclusions about how much coal burial contributed to cooling and glaciation. The interaction between vegetation, atmosphere, and tectonics in regulating climate is therefore an unresolved theme that continues to drive research. Uncertainties extend to regional biodiversity patterns. Fossil assemblages from Europe and North America are rich and well studied, but less is known from Gondwana and Asia. The full picture of global diversity remains incomplete, and ongoing exploration may reveal new species that alter interpretations. Discoveries of fossil forests in China and South America have already expanded understanding, showing that Carboniferous vegetation was not confined to Laurushian swamps, but also thrived in other tropical basins. Such findings highlight the importance of continued fieldwork. The debates surrounding the Carboniferous do not diminish its significance, but rather underscore its complexity. Each unresolved question points to interactions among tectonics, climate biology, and geochemistry that are not simple to untangle. The record is extensive but uneven, with exceptional preservation in some places and gaps in others. Interpreting this record requires collaboration across disciplines from paleontology and stratigraphy to geochemistry and climate modelling. The Carboniferous remains a field of active inquiry, where new data continue to refine old ideas and where uncertainties drive deeper investigation.